everyone, and enjoy the workshop. Thanks, Sean.
All right. Okay, yeah. Hello everybody. Welcome to the first workshop of the spring semester for the Hawaii Data Science Institute. We're going to be doing data wrangling and computational notebooks today. So if you go to the chat, there is a link that I just posted there that will have a shortened URL to go to the workshop materials that we'll be walking through today. So everybody go there. You should see something. You should see this, I think. So these are the materials that we're going to be presenting and covering today, and these should actually walk through everything that we're going to present. So just to start off with a little introduction. My name is Sean Cleveland. I am a cyber infrastructure research scientist. I am a part of the Hawaii Data Science Institute, and I'm also a member of the Information Technology Services Cyber Infrastructure team at the University of Hawaii system. I've been with UH for about the last 7 years. My background's in computer science, bioinformatics, and cyber infrastructure. And so, yeah, Oscar, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Oscar Alto. I'm a fellow with the Hawaii Data Science Institute, and I am a graduate student and a part of the oceanography department, which will become very clear towards the end when we deal with some real-life examples. And yeah, that's about it.
Okay, great. All right, so let's see. Let's go. We'll just cover a couple logistic things here for discussing setup here. So since we're using Zoom for this workshop, if you have some feedback or questions that you have during the workshop, feel free to go ahead and use some of the nonverbal hand raise features here in your Zoom area. So there should be, you should see a reactions button that you can push to do some of these things. If you don't see a reactions button, it might be because your Zoom window is too small or something. So there should be a more in a reactions area there. For today, ideally, with the technology that we're using called Binder, there shouldn't be anything that you need to set up or install on your local machine, and hopefully it will all just work through your browser. So at the start of all of the lessons that have materials that we'll be looking at for the notebooks that we'll discuss here, the computational notebooks, there'll be a Binder repo link, and we'll point it out that you can click. If for some reason we have a problem with Binder, I believe everybody should have an account set up for our HPC cluster that we can run this on. And so if that happens, then we can walk through the instructions to be able to access these materials and download them and run them on the HPC system. But hopefully that's not the case. So with that, I will get into our introduction here for the workshop. So why are Jupyter Notebooks useful for cleaning and wrangling data? Why should you care about this when maybe you do a lot of your work with Excel spreadsheets or Google spreadsheets or CSV files, and you've done that and you've had a lot of success in the past? So why do you need to look at adopting something else? Well, one of the things that we see with doing data manipulation through spreadsheets is you often have a difficult time manipulating thousands or millions of rows of data if the data sets that you're going to be working with get that large. There's also problems with being able to replicate manipulations that you're going to do. So sometimes if you're working with longitudinal data sets, and so maybe there are hundreds or thousands of these types of data sets, and you need to do the same thing to each one. It's really hard to do that with Excel and Google Sheets unless you're doing some sort of coding. And so that's kind of the idea behind these computational notebooks that we're going to discuss, is being able to work with your data, but also capture the process of all of the transformations or manipulations that you're doing with the data as you go, so that you can know what you did, and then you can also repeat it, and then you can share it with somebody else sort of as a process, and they can apply the same thing or understand what you did. So that's kind of the idea behind the Jupyter Notebooks. In addition to the notebooks, we'll be using Python today, and we'll also be using a library called Pandas. There's links to the website in the materials here that you can find if you want to get some more information. But Pandas is a pretty common library that is used with Python for doing data cleaning and some manipulations, and it works well with a lot of plotting and things like that. So I've been using it for the last several years, and I find it pretty useful to use. A couple things that we won't be covering today: we won't be covering basic Python code. We won't be covering how to set up the Jupyter Notebook environments, and we won't be covering any other language support through these notebooks. It is possible to have R, Julia, like a number of other languages that you can use within the Jupyter Notebook environment, but we're just going to work on Python today. So as I mentioned before, all the materials are hosted in something that's called Binder. So if you're interested in learning more a little about Binder, essentially what it does is it lets you take a GitHub repository and essentially run it in this service called My Binder. So it makes essentially what's called a container of all of the source code, and then if you set it up correctly, the dependencies that are needed to run it. So in this example of for us, we'll be having these Jupyter notebooks, so we'll have a Jupyter environment that it can run the notebooks in, and the packages that we need to execute the code that we're going to use today. So here is a link that you can click on. I want to right click and open it in a new tab to open up Binder. Oh, I guess that's the source code, sorry. We'll go to the next page. Here's the Binder link at the top. So this launch Binder icon, if you right click on that, that should start your Binder session here. So we want everybody to be able to go ahead and do that. So just part of the interactions here, how about once you've done that, go ahead and go to your reactions and just give me a thumbs up so I can make sure that everybody has been able to do Binder. And let me open the chat just in case not everybody got it. Let me repost the slide there, and then I'll also give a URL to, this is where we're currently at. We're currently on episode Jupyter Notebook Interface. So it's episode number 2. And then you can click this button here or right click it and open in a new tab to get Binder to launch. Okay. Has there been anybody who has not been able to get Binder to execute at this point? If you have a problem, just post in the chat. Okay. I don't see anybody posting issues in the chat, so I'll go ahead and move forward. So in order to actually, I guess, let me jump into the slides here. So everybody should have Binder open, and this should have started a Jupyter lab that has all the materials for the workshop as well as our notebooks, and you'll see these icons here. So if I go to our materials, we have some descriptions of what everything is here. So if you look at the image here, clicking the buttons in the interface here, Binder, clicking this one would start us a blank new notebook in Jupyter. This one will give us a Python console. If we needed a terminal for some reason, we could do that. Or open text files, markdown, all these kind of buttons. Do that here. You'll note the file browser here. So to access our notebooks today, we're going to double click on the folder called Notebooks in our browser. So if you jump over to Notebooks, you'll see that we have a list of all of our notebooks here that we're going to be walking through today. So they're numbered 1 through 07. So there's one for every episode. If you double click the introduction one, we're not going to actually run any code, but at least it will open a notebook for you. Number 202, Jupyter Notebook interface. We'll walk through some of this here. So let me jump back to the materials. So everyone should have double clicked on the notebook directory and go ahead and open up the 02 Jupyter Notebook. All right, some of the anatomy of essentially the notebook tab interface here. At the top, you'll see there's the save icon. If we're going to save out any of our work, the plus icon here, it creates what's called a new code cell. So this is essentially where we're going to be running any Python code and executing loading files and all that stuff that we're going to do with the Python code within these cells. So we're going to write code in these cells, and then to run those cells, there's what looks like a play button. So that's what we would push to run those. So if we look at the interface here that you should have in Binder, we talked about the plus for adding a cell. So if you click that, there's a brand new cell. We can type whatever we kind of want in here as far as Python code. We discussed in the materials that there's 3 kinds of cells. So there's a code cell. So that's for executing, in our instances, Python code. There's Markdown, which is sort of a formatted language for writing documentation and other documents. And then raw is just raw text. So if we choose any of those for our cell, we can change their type. But for the most part, we're going to be using code in this. One of the benefits of being able to use Markdown or raw text cells within the notebook is, for instance, this here, this is actually a cell at the top of this notebook. This is a Markdown cell. We can add in notes and documentation within the code that you're doing in your notebook. So you can make notes for yourself or make notes for other folks that might be sharing your notebook with. And then the Jupyter software automatically recognizes that these things aren't code. They don't need to be executed, and it can skip them as you go. So just hopping back to our notes, talked about our cell types. Oh, one of the shortcuts for being able to run a cell. So if you don't want to, at some point, if you're running a lot of cells, you can use the shortcut, which is Shift plus Enter to actually execute a cell. So if you want to go ahead, you can actually execute this first cell here. You just click inside the cell, and if you can push the run button and it will execute it. So that was a print command that said this is a code cell, so it should print it out for you. This is a raw text cell. You can see that up here. If you wanted to run this cell here, which is going to set a variable we'll call a equal to the value of 2. If you do Shift plus Enter at the same time, it executes that cell. And so you see every time you execute a cell, you'll see a number show up next to it. This tells you what order these things executed in. So we can actually execute code cells, not necessarily in a top to bottom order. So you can execute code cells in a nonlinear fashion. So you want to make sure that you don't get into that habit. I think it makes it more challenging to follow what you've done if you're jumping all over your notebook executing cells. So for a best practice, it's ideal that you're just executing them top to bottom. We talk about that here. So one of the other things to know, as I was saying, you can execute the cells kind of in whatever order you want. You can re-execute these cells. So that can actually cause you some issues. So in this example here, if we ran this cell, a equals 2, and then we print out the value of a, it's 2. If you ran a equals a plus 2, that will set a to 4. If we ran this again, as we see down here rerunning it, we'll end up with 6. And you'll see that the numbers incremented here. So we ran 1, 2, up above it was 3, 4. If you ran these two cells again, as it does here, 5, 6, that's what happens. So it's not really clear to you in the future necessarily how you might have gotten 6 because you don't have a record that you ran these cells as 3 and 4 prior. So just something to keep in mind and note about using these the notebooks here. And then also this is a cheat sheet to help you understand. As I said, you can use this to save. This icon to save. You can copy selected cells. So the way these notebooks work is they essentially have a kernel that is running some version of Python and some set of dependencies. And so as you're executing your cells, everything is running in this sort of kernel environment. Sometimes things happen where things break, and so you have to restart your kernel. So that's what this refresh thing here is. It restarts the whole environment. And so if that happens, you may have to rerun all your cells to get back any of the values that you may have lost from restarting the session in your notebook. And as I mentioned before, there's this code section here where you can change the type of cell. Okay. All right, so everybody should now be at a point where we can go on to looking at pandas and actually loading some data into our notebook. So how hopefully what in this lesson here, what we'll address is, how are the panda data structures set up? How do we load data into pandas, and how do we write data out of pandas? So pandas here is essentially organized into what we call series and data frames. So since most folks are familiar with Excels and spreadsheets, you can think of the data object when we load data into pandas. The data frame would be like an entire sheet from Excel or from your spreadsheet. That would be everything on your sheet. If you're thinking of the series could be considered either like a column within the sheet, or potentially a row within the sheet. But typically we probably think about them as columns here. Data types, as with Excel, you can often set your columns or your cells to text for formatting, or you have like different number types and things like that where you kind of set the format. Pandas essentially has a few types which can handle strings. So essentially it's called an object type, being able to handle things that are text and strings. If you have integers, it stores it in what's called an int64. That's just a 64-bit integer. The same thing with decimal float values are what the data type is, and then booleans, true, false, and then date times. So these are the kind of the basic data types that you can have within your pandas data frame structure. And then these are the kind of Python types they map back to. So, all right, so now we can get into actually starting to use pandas here and creating series and data frames. So the first thing in order for us to be able to use pandas is we have to import it. So if we go to Binder, and you go ahead and go to the data structures notebook and double click and open it. The first code cell that we can see here is the import pandas as PD. So this PD here is just essentially an alias for pandas. It's a common thing that we kind of use because programmers, software developers are a lot of times inherently lazy. So typing out pandas all the time seems too long. So instead, typing out PD is much shorter. So essentially we're saying, I want to import pandas, but I want to be able to make any call to pandas as PD. So if we execute that cell, we now have the library within the environment here, and we can start using it. All right, so loading and parsing data is the next thing. Obviously, if we want to do anything with pandas, we have to have some data. So a lot of the file formats that you're familiar with, text files, comma separated value files or tab separated value files. So text, CSV, and TSV files, Pandas can easily handle. If you're not familiar with what CSV normally looks like, basically it's values separated by columns, commas. So something like this would be kind of a standard CSV format. And this is what it would look like as a data frame, where the first value here is blank, and then you had column 1, column 2, column 3. A lot of times Pandas assumes the first row is what we call a header. So a lot of times you set names for your columns in your spreadsheet, and so Pandas is kind of familiar with doing the same thing. And then we didn't set one for the first column here, so that's why it's blank. And then these are essentially what we consider the values in our sheet or our table there. So let's see. Text files, delimited and fixed width. So delimited essentially is there's some sort of character that delimits essentially what we call a cell within like your spreadsheet normally. So in CSV files, that's the comma. If it's fixed width or space sort of delimited, so a space or a tab would be another way to delineate the change within the cells within the text file. So the reason I'm talking about this is when we tell Pandas we want to read in a file, we can tell it, how are the values separated, and so that's what we can do here. So in this line here, to load in this tab separated value file, this TSV file, we can tell it the separator is a tab. The /t, that's a representation for a tab value. So I believe in our notebook here, we actually have that. So we can actually execute this command. And then in order to actually see our data frame, we have to give our value here. So what we're going to do is we're going to execute Pandas. We're going to tell it to read in the CSV file. We're going to pass it a CSV file that we have in this data folder here called tsv_example.tsv. And then we're going to tell Pandas that this has a tab separation between the values. We can actually open up this example file here in Pandas. So it already knew that it was tab, that there's actually a delimiter in it. But so if we execute this cell, what you'll see here is Pandas will load it into a data frame. So we'll have a variable called df that we're assigning all of the Pandas data frame to. And so then we can use df to essentially access the data that we've loaded in from here on out within the notebook. So when we run df without anything, the Jupyter interface will essentially give us what looks like the table or what the spreadsheet would look like. So this is the data that we loaded in. I guess a little bit about the data that we're going to be working with. Oscar, you might chime in here. I think it's the Hawaiian Ocean time series set of data. Is that correct, Oscar?
Yeah, well, for the first few sort of episodes, we're just going to be working with like a really small section, but I'll give a real introduction to it once we actually start working with the full data set, or at least a much larger size one.
Right, and I think these are bottle sample data, right?
Yeah, they're water samples taken just north of Oahu,
okay,
for various depths.
Yeah, and so this bot ID column here is the ID of a sample bottle. So just to give a little more context to what we're loading in here. So, all right, so we've gone ahead and we've loaded in what would be a tab delimited like spreadsheet file into a data frame, and we've assigned it to this df variable in Python. We use the read CSV method to do that. There's also a read table method, which I believe we have an example of in the notebook here. So You'll note in the read CSV one, we had to give it a separator here since we are not using a comma. In this example here, read table, it assumes that we have some sort of space delimited method, so we don't need to pass that in. Just note that there's different methods to load data in for using pandas, and I believe there is, yeah. So this link here in our materials, this collection link, if you're interested, you can open this up. These are some of the different file formats and data formats that you can load in. So HDF5, XML, HTML, LaTeX. There's a number of different SQL formats that you can load into data frames, and there's methods for being able to parse those. So just know that. And then if you want more documentation on pandas, we do have the link here as well that you can go to and look at the documentation that will have all the methods that you can use for inputting, outputting data, and doing other manipulations in pandas. So that would be for another time, but just something to note. Okay, so we've read data in with the CSV, read CSV function and the read table function. Here's something that is useful. So say you don't want to read in your entire data set. Say you've got hundreds of, thousands of rows or millions of rows. It's a very large file, and you just want to have a preview of the first few rows within data. That's something that we can tell pandas that we only want to look at the first n rows. So n is just a kind of a programming term that could be n equals something. So in this case, we're saying what are the n in this case would be number of rows. So how many rows? 5 rows. And then there's a function that you can use called shape that will tell you, how many rows and how many columns does your data frame have in it. So if we go ahead and go to our notebook here in Binder, we can load in the first 3 rows of data to a data frame value. I wonder if I can make this bigger. Yeah, that's probably way more useful. Okay, so if I run this cell, it's going to load the data in, and then it's going to output this shape for us in a, well, we'll just run it and we'll see. So we said, I want to load in the first 3 rows. So that's the shape that we've got here. If we want to actually look and see what our data frame looks like, if you go and add another cell and do df, you can execute that, and then this will show you what we actually have in our data frame as well. But then it tells us we have 7 columns. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns. You'll notice, we'll talk about this here. There's this other one here that looks like a column, but this is really an index. So now we're getting to headers and indexes. So let me just take a moment and check in. Is everybody okay? If there's any questions at this point? I don't see anything in the chat, so I'll just move forward. So talking about headers. So one of the things you've noticed here, if we look at our data frame here, by default, when we read in the file, this example TSV file here, when we looked at this, the first row was actually a header, which was the names of what we would typically call a column. By default, pandas just read that row in and said, yep, that's what you are. You're the header row, and I'm just going to assign that. But there may be examples where you don't have a header row, and so you want to tell pandas that you have none. So this parameter here, header equals none, will do that. So in this, we'll load in a new file called no header example CSV. This one doesn't have a header, and we set header to none, and we can go ahead and run that. And you'll note that if we run this for this file with no header to begin with, and we didn't set that parameter, it automatically took the first row and said, oh, you're the header. So this column is named something that looks like potentially a date, something like that. So it's not accurate. So we want to pass in the parameter that says header equals none. So now when we run that command, now we have a header that essentially is set to what we would call an index for our columns. So if we wanted to reference at some point this column, previously, if we had a header, we could have said bot number, this bot hash here, it represents this series, this column. Date mmddy would represent this column, and so on. Now, instead, we have essentially just integer numbers here starting at 0 to represent our series or our columns here. And then we also have this another set of numbers here that represent the rows. So these are our row indexes and our column indexes. So these, we want to understand these, the idea of these indexes and these headers, because this is how we're going to be able to access individual cells, rows, and do some of our manipulation in the future. Let's see, common data loading problems. So one of the common things that a lot of folks that work with data, especially field data, will know is that you're going to have values. Some variables, sometimes instruments, they get damaged or they don't measure correctly, and so you're going to have missing data. And so that's one of the things that we want to be able to. We often have to clean up and handle before we can do any processing. So Pandas has something kind of handy for being able to identify values that are missing. So in this case, if we look at the null values example CSV file and load it in, the pH column has some missing values. So they're null. So if we want to tell Pandas that we have a not available value in there to identify those things as those aren't real data, we can set a not available value as null. And then Pandas will go ahead and replace all the nulls that it's read out with these NANs. So instead of saying this is actually data, which we could perceive this null as actually being data, these NANs will say this is not data at all. This is missing. So we don't want to do anything. This is also important because we talked about some of the data types. So Pandas will try and auto detect data as it comes in. So if you know that this null is not data, but is missing data, then it will ignore all the nulls and just read in the float variables and then say, okay, yeah, this column's actually float data and not an object like text or anything like that. So that's one of the reasons to note that. So we can go ahead and we can execute this just to run the cells, and so you can just see it for yourself. So you'll notice that, yep, pH is null in this one where we just read in the file with the read CSV. And when we do it here, it sets this to NaN. Okay. All right. The final thing here is once you've maybe read in some data and maybe you've dropped some columns, rearranged some things, sorted some stuff. If you want to write data back out, it's really simple to do. There's just a to_CSV method for the data frame in Pandas, and you can just pass it in what you want the new file name to be. So in this case, new file.csv. So if we were to run the cell that we have in our notebook, this data frame here that we just worked with should be written out to a new file CSV. And if we open it in our little browser, we can see that the pH values are actually not there because we said these are actually not data. So, all right. Okay, so at this point, we've been able to load the Pandas package. We've been able to initiate a data frame and load CSV and TSV data into it, and know a little bit about headers and indexes. So now we're going to go on to doing a little bit more wrangling here. So in this section, We're going to address how, how can you select columns or rows of data within the data frame? How can you subset data, which will be really useful when you're trying to do analysis. And then also, how can you sort some of the data? So for this, section, go ahead and open up notebook 404, data wrangling. All right. So let's look at how do we select data within Pandas. So we've loaded we've got our CSV data or whatever. We've loaded it into a data frame. So now you want to do something. So let's say we want to select a column out of here. And so we're interested in maybe the pH column. So in order to do that, since we have headers that are named, we can just reference the name. So if we want the pH column, we can use the pH header name, and we can say our data frame, and then in brackets, use what the header is called and access it. So when you do that, in this example here for this file here, we have indexes, which are not numbers in this case. So the index has been changed to something here, which would be a sample ID index in this case. And so when we select the pH column, you get the index list and then the values for the pH column. So if we go ahead and look at running this, so if we load Pandas into our notebook environment, we can then use the read CSV command to read in this selection data frame data set. And then we can do one other thing that's called index call parameter. So let's see, let's just run this without it first. So I'm going to make a new cell and go ahead and do this too. It's always good to try other things out. So if we just load in to our data frame variable, the CSV file, oh, I need to do this so we can actually see it. There is a column here all by itself. It's a sample ID column. And then you'll notice that we have just 0 through 7 for our indexes. So if we don't want to use these integer numbers to be able to reference our rows, and instead we want to say, well, I want to access them using sample 1 through sample 8 instead. That's the whole idea behind this index column. So we can replace the numbered indexes with one of the columns that we have for our data instead. So that's what this essentially does. So we'll do that instead. And now when we look at our data frame, instead of the integers, we see that we have the sample IDs there, and they'll be acting as our index. So now if we run this select column code, we get the indexes and then all the values from just the pH column. So this is useful for if we just spit out all the pH numbers. It's not as useful as being able to say, well, sample 1 had a pH of 7.95. So the other thing you'll note is that we get some additional information here about pH. What is the data type? And in this case, it's float 64. So, all right. So there we selected a column. Now, if we want to select a row, we're going to need to use a method called LOC, like location, you can think of it. So the LOC method takes, in this case, two values. One is the index that you want to use. So since we have named indexes, we can use sample 1. And then what columns do you want? And in this case, if we want all the columns, we can just we can use df.columns to get all of those. So if you actually make a new cell, you can just see what df.columns does. So df.columns just gives you all of the column names as a list here. So that's what we're going to be passing in here, is essentially this list of values, which are all of our columns. and then we're giving it this row. So if we do that, we get out the date, the pressure, temperature, these other values for just the row for sample 1, and you can double check like the date 40610 is the same. I guess it doesn't matter. pH, our pH is something that's different. So yeah, 7.951. So these are all this is essentially the row that comes out. So we mentioned that we have the headers and the indexes. They can be text, they can also be numbers. So if you want to instead use index numbers, you can use this iloc method. And so to actually do sample 1, if you remember, if we look back at our notebook, before we actually changed our indexing to be this column with sample IDs, here we had these numbers. So 0 in the integer indexing would be sample 1. So that would be another way to do sample 1 indexing. So if we run this, we'll get the same value here. So this is two methods of getting the same data. Just so you know that there's 2 ways that you can get this out. So if you have named headers or indexes, you can use the LOC. If you do not, you can just use this. Note that there's this other value here, this colon. So as we talk about the colon operator here, when this is used inside of those brackets, this essentially can return a range between within a list. So in this example here, if we have this list or this series here, X assigned to A, B, C, D, E, this would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or I guess there's 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 2 through 5 would output B, C, D. So 2, 3, 4, 5, everything except for the last one. So just the range between. When we use it here, this is equivalent to all of our columns because we didn't give it a range. So it just assumes the entire range here for columns. So that's why it did all of this. All right. So now if we want to select, if we don't want all of the columns, if we just want one column, one row so that we can get a single cell, we can just use in our case here, this LOC method with sample 1 and pH to get the value of our pH. So you execute that cell, that's exactly what you see. If we wanted to get our temperature and our pH, we would pass it essentially this list like this. So the Python list here, you got these brackets and then a comma separating the 2 strings. So this is column 1, column 2 that we want to have. So we're going to get back the 2 values within the sample 1 row. All right. So I think we're doing okay on time here. I see some stuff. X1 column 4. So we can actually just try this. So just copy that and actually everybody can try it.
I think that's a typo from a previous version. The example that we have on the page.
Yeah, I thought these were 0, 1, so Aditi is correct. So yeah, 1, 4 would give us this. So we'll fix that in there. But I was kind of confused too. All right. So where are we at now? We're in
I also
subset.
think there's another typo in the longitude there. In the example there, it'll be temperature in the notebook.
Got it.
My bad.
Yep. Yep. I found one of these and I fixed it. I forgot this one. Yep. In the notebook, it was adjusted. Okay. Okay. So now subsetting data. So this is going to be a super useful tool for exploring your data and being able to do things. So in our example here, we're going to be looking for pressure samples that were sampled at a pressure that was, say, less than 380 decibars. I believe that's what this is in. And so we are able to use all the Python comparison operators here within our data frame, so we can apply them to either the series, which would be the columns, or the entire data frame. And when it says in a vectorized fashion, that just means, you know, across every cell, say in your either in your spreadsheet or in your column or your row, in the same manner. So if we do take a data frame and we say, I want to look at this column, and I want all of the column values that are less than, you know, evaluate at 380. What this is going to do is it's going to evaluate out as a Boolean. So anything that is less than 380 will be true, and anything that's greater or equal to 380 will be false. So if we go ahead and rerun this in our subsetting section. So again, if you want to know what is in DF, we can make a cell. One of the things, I think maybe we didn't cover this, but you can actually drag these and change the order, which is useful if you end up running these things out of order and you want to rearrange them. So just to remember what's in our current data frame, we can reference it and take a look. And then if we run this, we can confirm, since there's only 7 values, you know, what's greater than 380. And so it's the last 3. So that's correct. Okay, so we know which rows you know, are less than 380. So if we want to subset the data, we can use this condition as a way to subset our data. So we can just actually we can assign this to a variable if we want, or we can just straight up use it as to be able to access the data within the data frame. So if you go ahead and we can run the cell where we assign this pressure is less than 380, and then access the variable. So if we assign it to good rows, and then we say, I want all of the values in the data frame that, you know, match this, we'll see a subset here. So we get sample 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which were the ones that were true. So now we have a subset of our data. We could assign this to a new data frame if we wanted to, and that might be something that you might often do. And so you would do like df2 equals that, and then you could say df2. That might be something that you want to do. As we mentioned, you could assign that to a variable if you're going to maybe apply this to a number of different data frames, or for readability, it might be useful. But you can also just, as we said, straight up write the condition and get the same thing. I think this cell's in here twice, so we'll fix that later. So that's one way we could subset the data. We could do the other direction. We could say is greater than, and we would get samples 6, 7, and 8. Okay. And here's a visual. So since we borrowed a lot of this material from a workshop that was done over the course of actually 2 days. Dr. Matty Belkate and I worked on some of this, but he made some of these nice diagrams here. But the equivalent of what we've done here is essentially you've taken the data frame and you've multiplied it by this true false sort of series. And so what comes out, anything that's false, essentially doesn't feed forward when you're accessing the data. So this is essentially what's going on behind the scenes. You're taking one matrix by another, and you're getting this out. So you can think of it like that. All right. So if we want to do comparisons between data frames, that's something that we can do with Pandas. So, and maybe you want to do this because you're looking for anomalies or something like that between data sets. There could be a number of reasons, but the way to do that is you have one data set here that would be DF, and a second data set here that would be DF2. And in this case, we're going to do a comparison between the column here that's this CO, this, I think this is some kind of
Oxygen concentration.
Oxygen concentration here, column, and see if there's any, values in data frame 1 that are less than data frame 2. And so just like when we did the column series pressure in decibars less than 380, and we got back this true false series, we would get back something similar here when we compare the two data sets on this column here. Remember that this colon operator here just means, in this case, since it's sitting in the spot that would be rows, it would be all the rows in the data frame, and then just this column. So we're just comparing these two columns to one another within the data frames across all the rows.
Can I have a question here?
Sure.
So do two data frame have to have the same size? I mean the same element, the same row. When you compare two columns, do they have the same element?
I believe if they don't match, you're going to end up with some. Well, you're going to end up with. Well, we can try it, I think. So we have DF2 and we have DF in this case here, where we know DF's shape in this case is 8, and then we have one here that I assigned out that was a subset, so we know they're not the same. So we can go ahead and run the run this. So if I don't load in this data here, if say we do it up here, and so we're comparing something that's size 8.6 to something that's size 5.6, you will see an error here, because it's looking. And the other thing is here, can only compare identically labeled series. So that's the other thing. So we're gonna run into an issue there. So in this case, when we're comparing these data frames here for comparison, our DF2, we're gonna load in this comparison data frame here, and it's gonna have the same number of columns and reference the same. So now if we do this comparison, we'll get out this series here, and we can go the other direction, and we should get we'll get something different here.
The sample 1 will always be false because one of those entries is none.
Right. Okay, and so so in this case, we were comparing just the column. We can compare the entire data frame one to the other. And so when we do that, in this case, we just got the single series because we were just doing a single column, which would be a series. In this case, we essentially get a data frame of every column with something that's true false here. Okay. All right, so the final one here for this is going to be sorting, and then we'll dive into Oscar's section here, which will be, I think, a little bit more hands-on and a little more into doing some actual exploration with the data. So sorting data, there is a pretty easy way to do sort on if you want to sort by the columns here. So if we do a DF and sort index, so axis 1 is essentially our header axis here. If we wanted to sort on that to get these, say, in alphabetical order, that would be what we would execute here. So again, just to, you can see what df looks like right now. And then if we run our sort axis, we've rearranged our columns and they've been sorted alphabetically. Now, if we want to sort by some values in a column, we can use, instead of sort index, we can sort by value. Sort values is the way to do this. And then we can say, what are we going to sort it by? So you can pass it the column, header, and then axis 0, and then whether or not it's going, ascending false or true for which direction you want to do the sort. So if we run this, we'll sort the data by the decibar pressure. And since ascending is false, it's going to be from the highest value down to the lowest value. And so it rearranges the values based off of that. So the rows, stay the same, and that it just sorts everything. So, okay, so at this point, everybody should be able to load the pandas package, load data in, do some basic subsetting, and being able to do some basic sorting. So with that, we can take any questions, and then I'll pass this off to Oscar.
All right. Well, in that case, it's time for my slice of the workshop. So pretty much what I'm going to be talking about is just a tiny bit more introduction to some data frame stuff, and then we're actually going to jump into using some of the stuff that we've learned previously, along with some minor new things to actually look at a real example from the Hawaiian Ocean Time series, where we're going to be looking at a much larger data set than any of these toy data sets that we've been working with. So we're going to be on the data frame analysis, the 5th episode. So if you're in this section, you can click there. I just have it already popped up. And then the associated Jupyter Notebook section is just this 05-data frame analysis. So if you open up both of those, and you can either have them side by side like me, or you can just have them layered on top of each other. So we've been loading in a ton of data frames, and we've been using, some of their associated attributes. And some of these you guys will probably recognize. Zoom in a bit so that everyone can see clearly. But so the 4 primary ones that I personally use a lot is shape, which, like Sean mentioned, returns a tuple that basically shows you rows, comma, columns. Size just returns how many elements. So that's how many data points there are in the data set. D-types returns the data type for each single column. And then columns just returns a series with all the header names associated with each of the columns. And of course, a list of all of these data frame attributes, because this is by no means an exhaustive list, can be found here at the data frame docs. So to start off, we can import the Pandas library. We'll load in a dummy data set once again. This is one that you guys are all very familiar with now. And before we do anything new, we'll just look at the columns briefly. So as we can see here, if we access the columns attribute, we get the names of each of the columns. But there's always stuff that we want to know more than just the columns. And one of the things that we probably want to know for various reasons is the data type that each column has been assigned, because as good as Pandas is, it doesn't always get the types right. So if we then run this D-types column, which basically D-types is just an attribute that each Pandas data frame has that basically just contains the header and whatever data type is associated with it. If we run that, we see that sample ID is an object. It seems right. Date is an int64, which it's not optimal, but with what it has, it's done a good job. And then the remaining ones are floats because of basically the fact that they're all decimal place values. But maybe, as you guys have noticed during the previous examples, the date format isn't actually optimal. It's in a month to day to year format, and Pandas is kind of treating it as an integer 64. So it's treating this as basically an integer value, which is probably not optimal. Now, if you remember way back to one of the earlier episodes, there are a couple of data types. And since this is a date column, it would actually be better for us if it was in a date time attribute, because then we can do more stuff with it. Basically, Pandas has an easier time manipulating it, that we can do a lot cooler stuff, as we'll see in the future. So to do this, we're basically going to use a method called toDateTime, which basically takes a column and then, using a format that we provide, turns that into a date column. Now, the format is a bit tricky, and so for that reason, I basically added a link to the documentation for the datetime format, because there's a whole range of formats you can potentially give it. But luckily for us, ours is fairly simple. So what we're going to give it is percent month, percent day, percent year, which basically just means that the first two or one entries is a month, the second two is a day with potentially a 0 at the start, and then the last two is just the last two in the year. So basically the last two numbers in the year. And so if we run this, where we basically say, okay, give me this column right here and convert it using the format that I just explained, and we'll get out a really neat format, which if you actually go into where I pulled the data, these are actually the correct dates and times. You can also, and I will note that here, but we're not going to be doing it, you can even go one step further and even provide hour, month, and second if you have that data associated with it. However, we haven't actually assigned this value to anywhere. So what we're actually going to do here below is we're going to run the same thing again, but we're going to assign it to a new column that we'll just call date, right? And then following the insertion of this date column, we no longer have a use for the date MMDDYY that we used. So we're going to drop that column, and then we're going to rerun df.dtypes to basically double check that everything is okay. And so if we run that, we can see that sample is still there. You know, our good old fashioned float values are still there, but we no longer have this date MMDDYY column. It's gone. And that's of course because we dropped it. However, here at the end, we actually have a date times 64 column. And if you look at the data frame updated, we can see that it looks pretty familiar, except at the end, we now have this really nice date column that looks that's a lot easier to work with, and just a lot more, you know, a quick glance can tell you exactly what year, what month, and what day the data came from. So scrolling down, this is basically just everything that we just went through. In addition to attributes and basically changing those attributes and those data frame types, data frames also have a ton of methods that you can utilize to make it really easy to do various, you know, classic computations. There's a ton of these. Once again, we're not going to go through all of them, but here's basically a table filled with them, with some of the most common ones. And then, of course, I also have a link to the full list of basically all these methods. But we're going to basically focus on one very easy one and one kind of a unique one. So the first one is this mean method. So as you can see here, we're going to be using the data frame that we've just been working with, this one right here. We're going to tell it that we want to get the mean, and then we're going to pass it this very interesting parameter called numeric only equals true. And what this means is pretty much that the data frame will calculate the mean for all columns that are numeric. Now, what does numeric mean? Well, numeric is just a column that's either float 64 or int 64. So what we will get here is basically, if we run this, we'll get a small subsection and we'll get means for each column. And by default, it will use columns. You can also provide it the axis if you want to instead of get row by row. Of course, that'll fail because each row actually has strings associated with it. Now, as we can see here, we have pressure, temperature, salinity, oxygen, and pH, but we don't have date. That's because dates aren't actually treated as numeric values, but if you really want, you can actually calculate mean dates and stuff like that. But for our intensive purposes, we've only used numeric columns, which means that only float 64s, or optionally, if we had int 64s, are going to be here. The second method that we're going to utilize here, if we scroll down a bit, is a bit more of a complicated method, and it's called a describe method. And it's kind of like just basically, if you load in a data frame, you just kind of want to get all the different types of statistics about it. You can use this. It's kind of a quick call, just give me everything you got. And so if we run this, and we give it include all, which basically means use every single column that's in our data set, including this first column, even though it's an object column. And as you can see here, we also tell it treat any date time values as numeric. And the output looks kind of like our input data frame. However, if you take a look, you can actually see that each column is represented here, and it has an associated count of values, unique values, the top value, the frequency of some of these, and then the mean, min, and all of these quartiles and the standard deviation. For some of these, like you can't really get a mean of an object of like a word. So for those where you can't do anything or the calculation fails, it will just give you an NaN value. And also another thing to note is when it comes to the count method, or this count row, sorry, you'll see that there actually varies the amount of counts. Now, this might at first glance seem kind of weird, but it actually makes sense if you scroll. If we actually look at, we won't scroll, we'll just insert the df here. You can also scroll up if you want. If we use the pH column as an example, we get a count of 3, right? But we know that there are a lot more rows than that. Well, that's because when you use the describe method, the count method only actually looks at the ones that are not NaN values. So if we count 1, 2, 3. So they're only actually in this pH column, there's only 3 usable values. And so when it does the mean, the min, the different quartiles, and the max, it only utilizes those 3 values that are actually applicable. And you can kind of see a less extreme example of this with the C-oxy, where we only have 1 NaN value, and we instead have 7. And this is kind of just a good method to utilize if you just, if you've loaded in a data frame and you just kind of want to get an overview of your columns. It basically describes as best as it can using all of these different methods that we've talked about, and just plops them all into what is essentially just another data frame. Now, those are some methods that you can use with data frames. There's also potentially times where you want to do arithmetic between either different data frames or different columns. So here we're not actually going to use these hot sample data. We're going to use a much easier example. We're going to load in a df_1 and a df_2. And basically what these do is they just generate those data frames that we see here in the figures for us. So if we run this, and then we look at the two, we can see that they actually perfectly align with what the figures look like. We can see that there's a column called AA in both, and there's a column BB in df1, and there's a column CC in df2. And let's say that for whatever reason, we want to actually add together the AA columns from df1 and df2, right? So using what we've already learned, we use df_1, and then we select column AA, and then we do plus, and then we do df2 AA. And if we run that, what we're going to get is a very interesting and strange output. We're going to get some nons, and we're going to get some actual values. Well, the reason that this occurs is actually because while the columns align, the row or the indexes don't, right? So what Pandas attempts to do when we do this is it attempts to add any rows that are A together, any rows that are C together, any rows that are D together, any rows that are T together, etc. But you can't add a value that doesn't exist to a value that does exist. And so as sort of a solution to this, Pandas will just output a non-value for wherever the calculation was unable to occur. So what we can see here is kind of the same thing here. So A, the row called A exists in both df1 and df2, so we get 100. C only exists in df1 and not df2, hence why there's a non here, so we get a non. D doesn't exist in DF1, but does exist in DF2, so we get a non. Both rows exist in, or T exists in both data frames, and then X only exists in DF1. Hence, we get the output. And also, if you maybe want to look flip side and you actually want to do row arithmetic, so potentially if you want to add, you know, let's say row A and row B together, you get something similar where row A has two columns, AA and BB, and row D and DF2 has AA and CC. So it'll add together the AA column, so 79 and 14, we'll get 83. But since BB only exists in DF1, it'll be in a non-value will be inserted into the DF2 calculation. And then since CC only exists in DF2, we'll get a non-value inserted into DF1, which leaves us with two non-values. Now, as a last thing, before we move on to some real life examples that I thought is good to just briefly go over and fairly simple is there might also be times where you have sort of a column and you just want to add a constant, right? Maybe, for whatever reason, you're like, oh, well, I want to add 0.3 to each of these values because maybe you did some calibration or maybe there's some other reason that you want to basically add. So using our example from earlier, this DF1 AA column, which just to remind everyone has 4 rows, one that's 79, one that's 2, one that's 13, and one that's 21, we can just add 0.3 as just sort of, can add it as an example. And what happens is that, as you would expect, each row entry gets 0.3 added to it, but notably, another thing has happened because we added a decimal value. The input column was actually of the data type int64, since these are all just integers. However, now we've added a decimal, which means that it's actually changed the data type to float 64. So it's actually different. Sorry about that. And so with that, we're pretty much done with kind of the introductory section, and now we can move on to actually some real life examples. But before we do that, does anyone have any questions? Because before we move on to the real life examples, I just want to make sure that any confusions are sort of tidied up. Everyone good? All right. Well, if there are no questions, we will then move on to the next section. See if we can just click. So now we're going to move on to some real example cleaning. So we're now going to be actually cleaning some real life data from that Hawaiian Ocean time series data set. And I'll talk a bit more about it. But before we start moving in, we are now going to move on to 06 notebook. So we deal with clicking all that. You should see something similar to this. And here I'm actually going to start asking you guys who are in the audience to actually do some, updates and some changes and things, and that from stuff you've already learned. And if you're confused or you don't know the answers, the solutions are also in the left-hand side stuff here. But before we jump into there, pretty much the previous episodes have kind of focused on key concepts, and we've used small and dummy data sets. However, these dummy data sets can only take you so far. What you actually want to do is you want to see, how messy is a real life data set? Because, you're never going to get a perfect data set as, handed to you usually. So to give us an example of this, I've downloaded basically over 20,000 rows of data from the Hawaiian Ocean time series. And just to give you some indication of where, kind of what we're actually dealing with, to give you some, some understanding is the Hawaiian Ocean time series has basically been collecting water samples from various depths from Station Aloha, located just north of Oahu, which is down here, since 1988. And these samples are online and can be easily downloaded by anyone. Now, because for various reasons, changes have occurred throughout the life of the HAWK program. And so for our intents and purposes, to kind of make life simple, I've downloaded the data set and we have the data set available to us basically between the 1st of January 2010 to the 1st of January 2020. And also, I've also set it so that the particular data that we're going to be using comes from bottles that have been that have collected water samples from 0 to 500 meters. And here's just a quick cheat sheet. You'll recognize some of these, like bot ID. So these are basically the column names that we're going to be working with, as well as what they actually measure. So, bot ID is bottle ID. You recognize the state format, pressure, temperature, salinity, as well as some new ones like dissolved organic carbon concentration, prochlorococcus numbers, the concentration of heterotrophic bacteria. If these all look, somewhat strange to you, that's fine. You do not need to know exactly what a prochlorococcus bacteria is. But to sort of do this, I've downloaded basically 20,000 individual samples. And so pretty much over the next 2 episodes, we're going to analyze the data by first cleaning it up, and then we're going to make some plots. And this first episode right here is basically us doing some cleanup. So how do we start? Well, to start off, we'll import pandas as we've done at the start of every single other episode. And we'll read in this hotdogsdata.csv. Hot Dogs is basically just the name of the website where you download data from. And like Sean mentioned previously, we're only going to load in for now the first 5 rows because we don't want to continuously load into over 20,000 rows. So if we do that, we see some interesting stuff. We see some columns that we recognize from some of the dummy examples, and we see some new ones. We also see some strange stuff going on here, where if you actually scroll to the far right, we see there's a lot of -9 values. There's non-values here on the right-hand side, and neither of these look. And this, should sort of make you think, this looks very strange. Just to sort of give an example of this, this column right here denotes concentration of bacteria in the water, and it's very strange to have a negative concentration of bacteria. And note that these are not comparisons. We're not doing, between 2 dates. This is like a water sample where you're saying this is how many bacteria per milliliter there are. And so this kind of sounds warning flags, or this should sound warning flags in your head. And since we see the same number repeatedly pop up, and also if you look at the documentation like I did, you will find that -9s are actually the value that they've used in here to basically denote null values, values that don't exist, right? And also, if you look at the actual raw data, you'll see that actually at the end of each of these, there's in the actual raw file, there's each row ends with a comma, which means that Panda thinks that there's another row here. But if we actually look at the raw data, we'll find that this is just basically a misstep by the input file. And that last column or that last comma doesn't actually mean anything. So to kind of clean up, to sort of start our cleanup process, we basically want to, 1, deal with those -9 values and make sure the Pandas treats them as not as -9 values, but actually as values that are missing. And then 2, we also want to drop that last column where that's only contains non-values. And this is where you guys can, you guys have already been told by Sean exactly how to do this. If you have trouble, you can either look at the solution or look previously. But basically, all I want you to do is basically just add the parameter as well as whatever the parameter should be equal to basically make it so that Pandas treats these -9s as non-values. And if you have any questions or any trouble, just type it in the chat, or just voice your concerns. Or if you kind of just want the answer, which I suggest you not do, but feel free, you can always just click on the solution right here, and it'll actually show you exactly what what the right answer is. So give that a few minutes and let me know if there are any issues. And then you can just sort of put a check mark or a thumbs up when you've completed it. I'm not quite sure what that means. Would you mind speaking up? I'm not quite sure, Uri, what you're question is, what if on specific column -9 is a value?
So what if there is a column with negative values and some of them are -9? Or do you
Okay.
remove specifically from a list of columns and not from the entire data set?
Good question. Yes, I forgot to mention that. So in our case, I've already double checked. An example of a column where that could potentially be true is the temperature column. I mean, temperature can of course be -9. In our case, I've already double checked, and since this is seawater, it'll never reach -9. But if you want to basically avoid specific rows or stuff like that, there are methods of basically dealing with this post process. So basically, if you have, let's say half the data set where -9s are a null value, and then the other half, those -9s are actually true values, what you're probably gonna have to do is actually load in the data and then actually basically specify, for these columns, treat these as non-values. So that you won't be able to use, because when the read CSV method is kind of just a blanket method over everything. And hopefully, -9s are maybe not the best value to use here, but hopefully, in the data sets that you're dealing with, there'll be some sort of string or something. Values are maybe not the best to use as null values. But good question. If anyone has had any trouble with this exercise, just let me know in the chat, and potentially me or Sean can help you. But if no one types anything, we will move on. Okay. So assuming that everyone has done sort of what they've done this example, we can kind of see here, we'll just look at the answers quickly. If we set NA values equal to -9, we'll basically get out, instead of having this, we will get out this. So here, as you can see, all the -9s are instead non-values. And so with this, we've kind of tidied up one part of the data set. And as already mentioned, I've already checked this before you guys did, but keep in mind that when it comes to values like that, you should double check the data set in its entirety and make sure that you're not actually throwing away values that are actually true values. In our case, I know that -9s are null values because I checked the documentation, but in your data sets, that might not be true. And then as a last thing, we also want to drop this blank column that we have, this really weird sort of non-column that's on the right-hand side that doesn't have a header and doesn't contain any data. And so in order to do that, we're going to want to basically grab the name of that column, and then we're going to want to drop it. And so what I'm going to ask you to do here is basically two things. So first, I'm going to tell you here to get the names of all the columns, and then keep in mind that the output of when you get the names of the columns will be in the same order as they are presented in the data frame. And then I'm going to tell you to take the name of this column on the right-hand side, plop it in here, and then with that, we will be able to drop it from the data set, and we will not have to worry about it in the future. So take maybe 3 minutes to do that. And if you have any troubles, you can always look at the solution, or you can, type something in the chat, and we'll help you out.
Sorry, Oscar, can you just quickly repeat how we would handle the problem if there was like a -9 in one of the values that we wouldn't want it to change to nan? How would you deal with that typically again?
So for that, I would probably not use this method. I would not, because the reason that we're kind of doing all this read CSV stuff is because it's kind of a nice way of like treating the data before it's even in the data set. But if you, for whatever, like let's say that, for example, that in this temperature column, there were actually -9 values, what I would instead do is I would basically just load in the data set with kind of like this. And then I would actually sub-select the columns as we've learned how to do, and basically select the columns where -9s are actually null values.
Okay.
And then I would tell Pandas, for these columns, -9s mean not.
Okay. Gotcha.
And so for our example, it would be pH and nitrogen and all these on the right-hand side. And then I would leave out, for example, temperature, if that's one of the ones where -9s are actually true values.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's what I thought. I just wasn't sure if you had some other pre-processing method before actually importing the data, like maybe with the actual data file that you did it with or something. But okay, yeah, thank you.
I mean, you could. There's for most of the stuff that we talk about, there's like 5 methods of doing it.
Yeah.
There's so many. There's such a range of things you can utilize, but sort of to streamline the whole process, we've kind of just focused on sort of some key concepts.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, the easy answer is also, there might be a potential method where you could specify within the read CSV method, NA values and then like for only these columns, but I've never actually had to use that in my experience. I've always kind of just dealt with the post-processing when it comes to that. I've usually just loaded in the data frame and then dealt with it afterwards.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. I have not seen anything in the chat, so I'm going to assume that we're all ready to go. So assuming that everyone either has figured it out or they just look at the solution to this is basically just to type in columns. We get out the columns, we can see that the order is the same, and we can see that our final, this one to the right of NO2, is actually, surprisingly enough, just blank. It's literally just an empty sort of string. And so what we can do is plop that in there. Note that we're using axis at 1. And then when we do this, also we will find that on the right-hand side, we've actually dropped that non-value. Note that we don't actually have this slice included here, so the -9s are still here, but we'll work on that in just a short bit. So with this, we've kind of independently treated both the -9 problem as well as the problem here on the right-hand side with this empty column. And now, as just the final thing, you can just incorporate all of these changes. I don't think we have an exercise for that. Nope. So what you can basically do here is you can just copy paste the drop right there, and then we can scroll up. We can grab the NA values, is equal to -9, plop it here after this one. And note in this read CSV command, right here, sorry, the read CSV command, we actually don't have the n rows equal to 5, because now we've kind of done everything we can with sort of loading in the small slice of the data set. So doing that, we can see that we're actually dealing with a lot of rows, same columns though, but everything looks good. We have nons where there should be nons and everything. Then moving on to the next section, we also want to double check, and we've already done this, but we basically want to deal with how to deal with data frame types. So if we look at this, everything looks pretty much right, but as we've mentioned previously, we have that issue with the date, right? And I'm not going to force you guys to go back and look at exactly how to deal with that, but oh, did we actually miss something? Right. We don't have to worry about this too much. You can do this exercise if you want, but pretty much all it does is it asks you to set the index column, which we've already learned, to basically this bottle ID, since this is a unique identifier for each row. So if you want to, you can do that. I'll do that for mine. I'll just copy paste the answer right here, just to make sure that I align with what is shown in the document. And if we do that, we just kind of see that, instead of having these 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, we basically have bottle IDs. And also, if this wasn't a unique column, it would have thrown an error, basically told us that, because you need to have a unique identifier for each row. So you can just add this comma, index, column, bot ID to this if you want. And then you can load it, and then basically your stuff will look similar to what's shown in the on the website. Now, following this, we then move on to basically looking at the DF types, kind of what we've already done previously. We can see kind of the similar problem here. I'll reload this. Note that now we don't have a bot ID because it's now an index. And we can see the ever-present issue with the date. And I'm not going to force you guys to go back and deal with kind of, in copy paste what we've done previously. So just to quickly do that, it's already here for you. It's the same thing we did previously. We're going to grab this column right here. We're going to format it using the same method we did previously, and we're going to set it to a new column called collection date, because that's what these are. It's basically the date of these collections, right? And if we want, we can also just look at it, and we can see that we have values from 2010 all the way to 2019. And then, of course, we also want to drop the old date column because we don't need it anymore. We've already chucked it. We have now two columns that mean the same thing, and we preferably want the collection date column because it's formatted in a way that Pandas can understand. So we can just drop that column, right? And with that, we have fixed some weird issues with null values and extra columns. We formatted our date column to be treated as dates by Pandas, and we're looking pretty good. We're nearing the end of the cleanup procedure. But like I mentioned previously, before we move on to the next step, let's just get a quick df.describe and just make sure everything looks good. So if we do that, we can sort of glaze over this. Everything looks fine, everything looks good. You can keep an eye on these max and min values, make sure that everything's pretty much okay. We have a variety of counts here, which some show that there are a lot of samples, or there are a lot of values for them, like salinity, while others have much fewer, like pH. There's only 885 rows out of our 20,000 plus that actually have pH values associated with them. So this column is pretty sparse. If we keep on going over, we can see that everything looks good, good, good. Oh, the NO2 column actually has some interesting stuff going on. So the NO2, which is basically the nitrite plus nitrate column, nitrate column, has 0 values associated with it. So we have no, in our entire 20,000 plus rows, we do not have a single value for this column, which, is kind of a shame. But that also means that there's actually nothing we can really do with this column besides, it kind of exists just. So to basically and since we only want to really focus on columns where there's actually data that we can use, we'll drop this column, this NO2 column. And so with that, the rest of the columns, they look pretty much okay. Min, max values look fine. And with that, we basically have a cleaned up data set where we have some collection dates. We have some heterotrophic bacterial abundances, even though all the ones you can see here, these dots mean that there's plenty of rows between these two extremes. And we're looking pretty good. We're kind of ready to move on to the next section where we actually take our cleaned up data set and we actually use it to make some plots. Sorry,
Oscar,
I realized that
I was going to interject here. If folks didn't see the chat, there is a way to actually do a per column NA value. When you read it in, it'll actually accepts a Python dictionary. So you can specify the header name, colon, and whatever value you want that NA value to be. So you can do that on load in. So that can save you some steps there. I did not know you could pass it a dictionary before, so I looked it up.
I assume that there was some method, but I've never actually had to I've never had to deal with that particular issue where it's like a mix. But thanks for posting that. That's really good. And so before we move on, if anyone has any questions, speak up. This is kind of, this might not be the most fun part of the workshop, but it is an important one, as we'll see in the next episode. If anyone has any questions, just type it in the chat or raise your hand or, If no one has any questions, I will move on to the last and probably the most fun slice of this whole workshop, which is where we actually get to plot stuff and see results and see how stuff changes. So if we scroll down, pretty much all of the text here on the website, I know that I haven't been following on perfectly here, is basically just what we did here on the right-hand side. And then here's kind of a summary of all the cleanup that we did. So if we click on the right-hand arrow, we now get to basically move on to real example analysis. And for this, we're going to want to load in the 07 or the final notebook. So here, once again, I'm going to see if I can, I'll move you there. So here we can see that we basically, at this stage, we've taken our hot data set, we cleaned it up. We basically have columns and rows that are actually good to go. And now we actually want to do something. We don't want to just stare at kind of a massive data frame, or we don't want to just like export this to an Excel sheet and just, you know, look at it there. We actually want to like visualize it and sort of see what kind of stuff is going on. And we also want to kind of utilize the changes and updates that we made to basically try and figure out, you know, to basically summarize it in different ways. And so here's going to come some final new stuff. And we're also going to sort of lightly touch on the Matplotlib library. However, the way that we're actually going to be using Matplotlib, which is a visualization tool, is actually going to be using it under, we're actually going to access it through Pandas. You can use Matplotlib directly, but just to sort of simplify the workshop, we've just sort of dealt with the interface that Pandas has with it. So before we move on, we're just going to run these two rows up here. And all these rows do is basically they load in the data and they basically just get us back to where we want it to be before, right? Because obviously our stuff doesn't, you know, the stuff we did in episode 06 won't transfer to episode 07. So but what this cell basically does is it just basically recovers what we previously did, right? And now let's just take a quick look. So with our cleaned up data set, we have approximately 21,000 rows and we have 12 columns. And if we look at the counts, so this is one of those methods that we talked about, we can basically get, oh, this should be changed. That's my fault. But this basically just gets you the same thing in a similar manner. But what we can see is that kind of the data is pretty much, you know, we can sort of look at the data and we can see three sort of trends. We have data that's found in almost every single row, or pretty much every row. So out of 21,222, we have those values for temperature, salinity, and pressure for almost all of them, and dates, of course. We then have a second set that's kind of found in 2,000 to 4,000 samples, where we have oxygen, phosphorus, nitrite, and nitrate. And then we have some that are really sparse, like, for example, pH, dissolved organic carbon, and these bacterial abundances. Now, to sort of just start off, we'll just do a really easy sort of, we'll just say, okay, let's just take a look at the temperature values that we find on our data set. And so to do this, we can just call our data frame and we can tell it plot. And what we're going to tell it here is we're going to say that the x-axis, so the x-axis of our plot, we want it to be the date. So that's aligned with this value. I'll actually do this so that we can actually see sort of what we're working with. So date is, of course, this column where we've reformatted it. And then this temp ITS-90 is basically just the temperature column, right? And then kind, you can change this to a ton of different things. You know, the plot methods, there's a variety of kinds of plots you can make, but for our intents and purposes, we're just going to use plot. And then, so if we run this, it'll take a while, and then we'll see an absolutely horrific plot. We see values that range from below 10 degrees all the way up to a bit over 25 degrees. And so if we think about this, it looks quite strange, but then we think about, okay, where is our data set coming from? Well, like I mentioned, this is over several years, as you can see here on the x-axis, but it's also over a range of depths from 0 to 500 meters, right? So obviously the temperature that you have at 0 and 5 meters is not going to be close to what you have at 500. So in order to basically kind of remove values that are from super deep depths, we're going to use, once again, one of those concepts of selection and subsetting that we learned previously. So here in the next slice, we're basically just going to do surface sampling. We're only going to focus on the ones that come from the pretty much the 0 to 100 meters. So what we do here is kind of what we've already learned, where pressure you kind of treat as almost as akin to depth. So the lower the pressure, the shallower the sample comes from. And so we set it to less than 100. So we're basically going to get samples that are from less than 100 meters. And we're going to set this newly created data frame equal to surface samples. And then we're going to run the same plot device again. We run that. And this looks a bit better. We definitely do not have the range of values that we had previously. And we can also kind of start to see, if you really squint, you can start to see that there does seem to be some, up and down going on within, 0 to 100 meter samples. But once again, there's a lot of noise here, right? And so what we may want to try to do is maybe we want to try and group these by year, right? So maybe we want to say, oh, well, let's get the mean for each year and turn that into a data, right? And this is where the fact that we've converted our date column to this format that's supported by Pandas is very helpful. So what we can do here is we can take our surface samples. Note that this is those surface samples that that are basically rows that have values of less than 100 pressure decibars. And we can basically group them into years, right? So in our data set, we have several years, as we can see here, and we're basically just going to calculate the mean for each of these years. And if anyone here has worked with R, this group by method is very similar to that. If we run this, we can see that since we didn't specify a column, we get the means for every single column where it's possible, right? So we get the means for 2010 in pressure, in temperature, in salinity, in oxygen. And then, of course, for some of the other columns, like dissolved organic carbon, where we don't have samples from every single year, we get nons, where there are basically no samples to calculate the mean. And then we can basically, so now that we have these grouped into dates here on the index side, we can do, once again, the same thing, but with this data frame instead. So we'll take grouped surface samples, we'll plot, once again, the temperature, and if we don't specify anything, it'll automatically assume that we want to use the index. And once again, we'll use the kind of plot we want will just be a normal line. And that looks a bit sad, but this is basically the mean for these temperature values that we have from our 20,000 plus samples, right? And so it's a lot less, there's a lot less noise going on if you compare it up here, but it's kind of a sad thing though, because we've grouped these into years, we've missed out on any seasonal patterns. So looking back on this, maybe it's better if we actually group these based on month and year. So maybe we, instead of grouping them by year, we actually want to group them by, January 2010, February 2010, and then all the way up until the end, until December 2019, because we sadly don't have any data from the 1st of 2020. And so to do that, we'll basically just reuse some of this code. So once again, we'll use the surface samples, note, we're not using the group surface samples. We're using the surface samples, which are these less than 100 pressure decibars. We're going to use the group by method again, but if you scroll over here, it's a pretty long thing. We're going to group these by two things. We're going to group it by the year, and we're going to group it by the month, right? Let's scroll down. So here's the full thing if you are interested in not having to, move back and forth. And so for each year and month combination, we're going to calculate the mean. If we do that, we can see, dates. So we get two date indexes, which is kind of strange, but you can rename those when you're doing your own analysis if you really want to. But basically what this shows us is, we have 2010, 3. So this will be January, February, March. We have April, May, June, July for 2010. And then we have December 2019, and all of these different, months basically, and all of the ones in between, which are what these triple dots mean. And now with these basically grouped together by both year and month, we can once again use the same sort of method here, but note that we've now updated the group surface samples to instead be grouped by year and month. And if we plot these, oh, look at that. We can see some seasonal variations of them going up and down between the years. And these are, this is most likely summer, and this is most likely winter. Because note that these come from just north of Oahu, so we're dealing with the northern hemisphere. And so as a final note before I leave you guys, or before we sort of finish the workshop, we've been focusing exclusively on temperature values, right? But let's say that you maybe want to deal with some columns that don't have data for every single sample or every single row. And let's also say that you actually want to have you don't want to have just one line, you want to have multiple on the same plot. So how do you do that? Well, like I mentioned, when we do these group by and we do the mean, we never specify a column. So these month or these year and month rows means are actually for every single column we have in the data set. So we can just pretty much do the same thing as previously, but specify a different column. We just change the Y to a different column. And if we want to go one step further and we actually want to have multiple lines on our plot, we can actually just specify them as a list. So here we have that same group surface samples, but the Y is instead equal to a list. So here we have heterotrophic bacterial concentrations, we have Prochlorococcus bacterial concentrations, and Synechococcus bacterial concentrations. You don't have to know what they are, but these are three that are less, less abundant row-wise in the data set, in that they're only found in under 1,000 samples in our input data set. And of course, we're just going to make the same plot again with the kind being line. And with that, we can see that we have three different plots. We can see some holes in the data. These are basically akin to where we don't have any data for these. And we can see that they pretty much occur concurrently, which suggests probably that during those sampling expeditions, the equipment required to count these was probably just not there, or it was broken or something. And then in addition, as sort of a quick sort of tidbit, this S-bac, this is Synechococcus, this is a particular bacteria that's only really found in coastal environments, while Prochlorococcus, or this P-bac, they're usually found in oceanic locations. And looking at this, it kind of makes sense, because like I mentioned previously, the data that we're dealing with comes from Station Aloha, which is located just north of Oahu, right? So it's in an open ocean environment. So we don't expect a lot of coastline there, but it is sort of an open ocean environment. And so sort of our results here kind of make sense in that degree. And now with that, we've kind of reached the end of this workshop. But I do want to stress that sort of, I hope that you've all learned some useful skills and kind of, this kind of shows you some of the usefulness of using Jupyter Notebooks. But I will also mention that there's a lot of things we weren't able to cover here since we only have 2 hours. So I would highly suggest that, take a look at the Pandas docs to, get additional details regarding a lot of the stuff we weren't able to cover here, kind of like what Sean did in the chat, where he found a method that I've never actually used. And then also there's a lot more that you can do with these plots, right? You can dive deeper into Matplotlib, and so we have a link to those Matplotlib docs. But there's also plenty of other plotting libraries, like for example, Plotly, which basically allows you to make dynamic plots where you can actually mouse over individual data points and actually get information on, right? And so there's still plenty of stuff to learn. But with that, we've come to the end of pretty much my time and the workshop. And so with that, if you have any final questions, feel free to speak up or type in the chat or raise your hand.
Oscar, I have a question.
Go for it.
Just curious how you think, now that you have these new skills and you're using this interface, how do you think this has improved your ability to analyze your data? Or has it?
I think, well, I think so. A very simple answer to that is even before this workshop, I've been using these extensively, and definitely throughout
okay.
basically creating this workshop, I actually learned a lot of stuff. Like, I mean, even in today's workshop, like I mentioned, Sean posted that in the chat, and I've kind of just always done it where I've loaded in the data and then dealt with the null values.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that sort of what's nice for me is that a lot of the stuff that I do is sort of, very lengthy, and there are very long processes, and kind of, it's a combination of like, oh, I remove these rows, and then I add these rows, and then I do these calculations, and then I do this, and then I do that. And I think that one of the things that Jupyter Notebooks kind of helps is that it makes it very natural for you to basically deal with data. And it kind of almost, if you work in it through that kind of format, you just end up sort of naturally typing out your stuff in a way that other people can see. Because, it's very important whenever I'm trying to show other people, or I'm trying to go back, like sometimes I do, where I have these super long, pipelines, and I try to, go back and look at what I did maybe a year ago. The fact that I can just do that in a very easy manner through Jupyter Notebooks, and that I kind of just like automatically document for myself, I think is, incredibly helpful. I think that that's, one of those things that is undervalued until you don't think about it until it's too late.
You don't think about it in the moment. You think about it 6 months later, and you're like, how did I do that? I don't remember how I did that.
I mean, it's definitely, like, I mean, a good example of that is just kind of, see, I can actually, let's see if I can actually do this. Let's see if I can find Zoom. Here. So here's actually my own Jupyter Notebook stuff, and it's actually R. So this is R data, so it's not going to look like the Python. But you have a table of contents. So this is actually stuff that I've shown you guys. You've seen the final figures, but it's kind of describes workflows to visualize differences in abundance, the differences in abundance across depth, and then across the global ocean. And there's a ton of warning messages here, but those are fine. Trust me. But then as you scroll through, I can see exactly where I make changes. So like here, I filter by sampling depth, and I get out plots, and then I keep going down, I get out other plots, and you can just get these really and it's all kind of self-documented. So when I need to update stuff, I need to change stuff, I can just kind of go here, update stuff, and then keep moving, and it's kind of all just documented right there for me.
Awesome, that's great.
It's very nice.
Also, I just want, as I was listening to the workshop and looking at just the narrative that you captured for your whole project, I think that's super useful too. It will make it really interesting to folks, because you're telling the story about your project too at the same time. So
it also makes it a bit more interesting for yourself, because you're like, okay, right. I looked at this, and then I move on to this, and now I'm here. And you can also sort of look back, and you're like,
what was I thinking?
You're like, what was I doing, and where did I go wrong? Or maybe if something looks strange in like a plot, you can say, okay, you can go back and you can say, oh shoot, there's an extra 0 there, and that messed everything up. And then you just change that 0, rerun the whole Jupyter Notebook, get all your plots out, and you're good. And you're good to go, rather than going back into 10 different files and thinking, what did Oscar from a year ago think? What was he doing with his life?
The evolution of Oscar in a Jupyter Notebook, right? Yeah, that's
you can definitely see that. You can look at some of the real old ones, just from when I just started out. They're very different from the ones that I make now. So definitely an iterative. It's like writing. When you just kind of have to continuously write your Jupyter Notebook, and you'll get better.
Yeah, awesome. Well, wow, yeah, it's a great job. This was really good. Really good. Hope everybody else learned something too.
All right, there's nothing else. We filled the time exactly.
I actually I followed your section, Sean, and you hit it perfectly. Each, like the initial estimates for time for each episode, it was almost scarily. It was like marked on after an hour you were done.
Yeah, okay, awesome.
Okay, well, have a great weekend, everybody.
Yeah,
And
have a great weekend.